Hi, and welcome. Looking forward to the coming hour discussion about what happened at Rio+20 and what that means for today and for the next coming years. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Wagner, the Senior Director of Tracking Progress at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I want to offer a few housekeeping notes before we get started. The webinar will be 60 minutes. It's being recorded and we'll send you a link to it after the session today. If you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom. And if you see some questions that you're interested in, you can vote on them so that the moderators know that that's a particularly big burning question for many of our participants. And then the chat is open for respectful insights and resources will be shared there. But we also want to find out who you are. So please answer the poll that you see right now to let us know where you're coming from. And also let us know how you were involved, if you were involved in the Rio+20 negotiations themselves, if you're now involved in SDG implementation, if you're involved in the SDG negotiations, or none of the above. So it'd be really nice for us just to find out a little bit about you before we get started. So today's webinar is part of a series that we're planning on the road to the SDG Summit in September. So we'll have some webinars around HLPF. And then prior to the summit itself. And so we'll share the links for those webinars with you at the end of the webinar. Let's see, I think, are we closing the poll results now? Let's see if we have. So great. Wide variety of backgrounds, I guess, favoring so Africa, Latin America, North America, but some others from other parts of the world, and great to see a wide variety of backgrounds with the Rio+20 negotiations, as well as some people who have come to the SDGs more recently. So great, and thank you for joining us. Welcome. Let me see, I guess I want to now turn it over to Irena Zubcevic, who's the director of the Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future. She was with DESA during the negotiations of Rio+20 and the negotiations of the SDGs. We're very happy to have her with us. Stakeholder Forum was co-organizing this webinar from the start. So thank you so much for joining us. And Irena, I'll turn it over to you to set the stage for today's talk and to introduce the keynote speakers.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and greetings to all. I have to say that I'm really excited to be at this webinar today because, you know, in 2022, when we had the 10th anniversary of the Rio+20 conference, it passed under the radar, and without this conference, there would be no sustainable development goals. These goals did not just happen. They were a product of vision, but also hard work and dedication of those who were working in the area of sustainable development at that time. And today we have two people that were once of the most instrumental in getting us the SDGs. And they are, as we have heard from Lynn, Paula Caballero and Farrukh Khan. I was privileged to have spent many hours talking to Paula about her recollection of the SDG process, which I have described in the SDG chapter in the book published by Routledge last June, Heroes of Environmental Diplomacy, and worked with Farrukh supporting the Rio+20 process when he was the main negotiator for the largest group of developing countries at the UN known as G77 plus China. And I will quote just one thing from the book. When it was almost certain that SDGs will be the outcome document, Paula was concerned with the evolution of the negotiations for the SDGs. She told me, and I quote, She did not want another intergovernmental document with no or little possibility to be implemented, with empty political declaration masked as goals. She really wanted the goals to be transformational and change the course of development for a more inclusive and sustainable world. And Farrukh, together with Paula, played his part when he stormed out of the G77 meeting, saying he would resign as negotiator unless he was given a free rein on this. And they succeeded. The process for the most inclusive, the process that they envisaged and set up was the most inclusive negotiations to date, based on evidence and science through the open-ended working group on SDGs. And it was really the historic way how negotiations were conducted. So without further ado, let us turn to our speakers, Paula and Farrukh. Paula, who was Director for Economic, Social, and Environmental Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Colombia, has since left the government and is now working as the Regional Managing Director for Latin America at the Nature Conservancy, which is the biggest environmental NGO in the world, working across more than 70 countries. I'm sure we are going to hear interesting points from Paula, but the time is short, so I also encourage you to read her book, Redefining Development, The Extraordinary Genesis of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a treasure trove for all who want to know how SDGs were conceptualized and adopted. Paula, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to IASD and to Stakeholder Forum, both of who were great partners with us when we were trying to get the SDGs to become a reality. So it's wonderful to join you today, as well as everybody else who's on this webinar. I want to start off by just underscoring that the SDGs were not inevitable. They were actually rather miraculous. If it hadn't been for a small group of people that really fought for the idea, the concept, and as Irena was saying, to create the open working group, what we would have had in 2015 was just a rollover of the MDGs, which were great. They were a first metric that really were very transformative, but they were completely insufficient. They were minimalist. They divided the world into developed and developing countries, and only developing countries had any responsibilities for action. And they were very myopic in the fact that they were focused on a few narrow social targets or goals, rather than looking at the complexity of development. It didn't include things like energy and agriculture and industry and competitiveness and gender and water, just to name a few. So where we are right now is that we need to recognize the immensity of that paradigm shift, so that when we look now to implementing the SDGs, we look at it with the same kind of a transformative lens, with the same kind of bold ambition. I want to give you a quotation from Nelson Mandela, which has to be our clarion call as we move forward on SDG implementation. He said, "It is impossible, full stop. It is impossible until it happens." And that's where we are right now. We have to do what is impossible, not just tweaking reality as we would have tweaked the MDGs, because then you don't get to that transformative vision and framework that were the SDGs. We need the same kind of boldness and ambition right now. That is the big lesson from the negotiations. And why was it such a huge paradigm shift? I mentioned that the SDGs were the first universal agenda. This was even before, some months before Paris. And I would like to say that it also, because both processes shared a lot of the negotiators, really pointed to the fact that you could have and needed to have a universal agenda where all governments, all countries had to step up. It was comprehensive. We were not talking about simply ending poverty or ending hunger. We were really looking to how you shift food systems and make sure not that you end hunger, but that people have adequate access to nutritious food, that you go much deeper and are much more demanding in what those outcomes are and what it is that the transformations are. That you look across the whole board of development, which is what we did when we were proposing the SDGs. And when I say we, I mean that village of people. Farrukh was an absolutely key and essential player and partner in all of this, but there were many others also behind the scenes, including the SDG Secretariat, that were really making all of this possible behind the scenes. So as we look now, what are the lessons from the MDGs? As I say, it's to look at what is needed, not what is possible. One example I can give you of what was needed and was absolutely impossible was that we actually, and for those of you who are deeper into UN systems, will know that it is impossible to get tracks to come together. We have a climate summit and an SDG summit, and the two are not coming together, even though they should be one only and the same. And it is because they have different parents. Well, we took two processes that had entirely different processes. The Earth Summit process, it started in 1992, and the MDG process, which came from a completely different track at the UN, and we wedded them. So there were so many reasons why the SDGs were completely improbable, both in terms of the ambition of a universal agenda, in terms of the depths of the integration across and within systems that we were asking for, as well as the fact that this was really an agenda that was going against the grain of how the tracks, the different negotiation tracks had been set up at the UN. And that is what we need today for implementation. But where are we with that implementation? Well, we're not doing very well, I have to say. The first is because we have forgotten that the SDGs are about integration, and everybody just keeps looking at the specific targets, measuring them, and then asking, ooh, are we living up to the SDGs or not? Are we implementing them? And the answer is no. There's no point in implementing specific independent targets if you're not looking at the linkages, at the synergies, at the trade-offs between targets, between issues. If you look at things like water use efficiency or infant mortality or women's empowerment or competitiveness, these are all issues that spill out across each other. And yet we're back in our little siloed mentalities, in our little a word that we stopped using, the pillars. There are no pillars, there's dimensions. That's the deep lesson of the SDGs, and we're not doing that. We're just adding up targets. Secondly, we're really not being as disruptive as we need. You know, there's that wonderful saying, which I like very much, never waste a good crisis. Well, actually, that's what we've just done. We had a major disruption in the shape of the pandemic. We talked a lot about green recovery. And the reality is that there wasn't a green recovery. And now, if anything, we're shooting up in terms of the number of investments in fossil fuels. Last year, Saudi Aramco had a whooping rainfall, profits of $161 billion, which I think is fairly obscene. And so we're missing that opportunity. But what the pandemic showed is that depth of the kind of disruption that the pandemic wrought is exactly the kind of approach and the kind of ambition that we need to have, the kind of disruption that we have. So we have wasted that crisis, but the invitation is, just as those of us, the many of us that were advocating for the SDGs had in mind a much bigger and a deeper reality of what was needed, when we implement now, look to the disruption that we had in the pandemic, and let's think about how we can willingly, consciously identify the points for that kind of disruption. Because let me tell you what is, to me, the core and the essence of SDG implementation. One phrase: 2030 is now. We can also say 2050 is now, if we're looking at the long-term strategies that most countries have developed under the Paris Agreement. 2050 or 2030 is now. What does that mean? That we do not have 7 years until 2030 to implement anything, or 2050 to implement anything. What we do now, the decisions we take now, the policies we put in place, the investments, what are we investing in? Look at all of the public lands in the US, for example, that are being opened up for drilling, for exploration. What are the investments and the decisions and the land use plans that are being put in place right now? Because that's going to lock in entire pathways that take us to very different realities. So if we are right here, if now is right here, what we decide, what we invest in, what we act on right now will take us here or take us here. And quite frankly, the direction of travel is very much business as usual, which is exactly what the SDGs were trying to break us out of. So 2030 is now, has to be our clarion call, has to be what guides us into what kind of decisions we need to take right now. If we think that we have 7 years until 2030, if we think that we have X many years until 2050, we will again have missed the boat. We will again have wasted a crisis. We will again be back into a business as usual scenario. And that is what is happening. We're just looking at the targets, measuring up individual targets, trying to figure out if we're meeting them or not, and entirely and completely missing the big picture, missing the linkages, and missing that evolution that is very much at the heart of the SDGs, and which is what we had envisaged when we wanted to get the SDGs to be the new paradigm, to be the new backbone, the new reality of development, not just for government, but very importantly for private sector at all levels. The SDGs were really one of the first items to come out of the UN that all of private sector could engage in. And that's what we need also right now when we look at implementation. How do you bring all of those stakeholders together? I would say that another aspect that is really important as we try to think about what that disruption looks like is a really simple approach to what sustainability means. Let me share this with you. From my perspective, what sustainability means is simply that you have the three capitals: natural capital, human capital, and economic capital, and that you identify pathways forward that mutually grow and reinforce those three capitals. At a minimum, that you do not make or take decisions or actions or investments that undermine one of those capitals at the expense of the or grow one of those capitals at the expense of the others. That is what we're looking for. That is the clarion call. That is the invitation of what we need to do right now. But it is not sufficiently happening right now. I think that one of the very key opportunities that we have is to, first of all, align the SDGs with climate. Understand that they are one and the same agenda. We now have the global biodiversity framework. That also is the same agenda. We have been speaking for years, decades, about the need to integrate reporting, but this is much more than that. This is really about stepping up and helping governments and helping private sector align their business models, align their development strategies, align their national development plans in ways that are mutually reinforcing across these agendas. Linked to that has to be the issues around water. We just had the UN Water Week. What came out from that meeting in terms of how dire the situation is, the levels of water stress around the globe now and in the future are really daunting and sobering. And all of these arenas, all of these areas are still treated in completely separate and isolated ways. Everything that came out of the UN Water Week needs to be integrated into SDG implementation. And as we look to this big SDG Summit, the big question, the big invitation is, just as we were able to do in 2010, 2011, 2012, when we brought two agendas that were completely separate, disparate tracks, when we brought them together. And we're able, because of that union, to create this remarkable backbone, which was the SDGs. The invitation now to you, stakeholders, the invitation now to the UN, is that we do exactly the same once again and bring them together. So in summary, the potential, the promise of the SDGs is there. We are not meeting it. We're not really stepping up to the disruption and to the ambition that is embedded and at the heart of the SDGs, because we're still implementing them and seeking to go about them in a very business as usual way, just tweaking around the edges and adding up targets. The kinds of systems approaches that are needed are not happening. At the Nature Conservancy, for example, that's exactly what I'm doing with my team. I've told my team, if we're going to keep doing the same, we might as well turn off the lights, because they will be turned off eventually. What we're looking is, in every single place that we work, how can we put in place systems change approaches that leverage the policy, the markets, the finance, with the on-the-ground work that we've been doing for decades. That on-the-ground work is no longer sufficient. So we need to bring it all together. We need to really and truly challenge ourselves. I've told my team, if you wake up every morning feeling that we're doing a good job and that we're on the right track, then think again, because we're not. There's a wall of lava that is coming towards us. That's the image I have in my head. A wall of lava, which is the current systems and the current ways of doing things. And that wall of lava is relentless. And we do projects and we do small policies and we do things here and there. And the world would be much in a more dire situation. This planet would be in a more dire situation. Vulnerable people will be in a more dire situation if we hadn't done everything we've done. But it is insufficient because we're still just pushing back that wall of lava here and there. The wall of lava of extractive, exploitative production models, of unsustainable consumption patterns. All of that is still coming our way. We need to really figure out how we change the systems so we're not pushing back that wall of lava, but really and truly making it disappear, really and truly eradicating it. And we can, if we assume and understand that 2030 is now, that the decisions have to be taken with a long-term perspective, and that we do not have 1 year or 7 years or 20 years to any given milestone that we make up in our human heads. The reality is now, act now, do it now, be decisive now. As Nelson Mandela said once, it's impossible until it happens. My invitation to you is to make it happen. Thank you.
Many thanks, Paula, for this plea, and the system change and the business as usual is not an option. And now we are going, I have a few questions, but I'll leave it for the Q&A. We are going to Farrukh, who is in government, so maybe he can also tell us why this is not happening. Farrukh, who achieved great strides at the global level, apart from SDGs, also setting up the Green Climate Fund, and being a senior member of the then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's climate team, and chef de cabinet of the President of the UN General Assembly of the 76th session, is currently working the Foreign Minister of Pakistan as Director General for Economic Coordination, Economic Diplomacy, and Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And as you have heard, he was one of the instrumental figures also to get us the SDGs. So Farrukh, over to you.
Thank you, Irena, and thank you for this very generous introduction. You found me in a sweet spot when I'm with the government and I'm not with the government. I'm not occupying a position due to some personal reasons. And that gives me more leverage as such to give my analysis on the questions that you have posed. But starting off first, thank you for this invitation. And it's always great to hear Paula, my old friend and collaborator. She was phenomenal. She has been phenomenal. And she's doing a great work and spreading that phenomenalness, as I would put it, across the globe. With respect to your questions and where we are, I am going to make one observation or a contextual point. I'll limit myself to 5 lessons that I think are important for us to draw, and perhaps 5 ideas for the future if we can look at it in that sense. So first, my observation, or rather to contextualize this, where we are today. When the SDGs were launched, I recall reading a leader in The Economist. And last night I went back to dig it up. It had a funny beginning and a important title. It said, "The 169 Commandments." And it began by saying that Moses brought 10 commandments down from Mount Sinai. If the UN's proposed list of sustainable development goals were as concise, the SDGs are supposed to set out how to improve the lives of the poor in emerging countries and how to steer money and government policy towards area where they can do the most good. But the efforts of SDGs drafting committee are so sprawling and misconceived that the entire enterprise is being set up to fail. That would be not just a wasted opportunity, but also betrayal of the world's poorest people. it concluded by saying, the last sentence was that SDGs are full of good intentions, but everyone knows where good intentions lead. And I remember this article, and I thought it's worth quoting from where we are today. And today we have spent 8 years, and we are 7 years from our deadline to achieve, or at least make progress on the 17th development goal. And this criticism appears that those people were right. We are not only off track, we are on a mission to rescue the SDGs now. We did not learn from the implementation of the MDGs. And the global economic and political situation indeed does not suggest that we can change this direction. With that context, let me now turn to the lesson, which I believe from my experience and where the vantage point that I have of seeing this. First, I'll pick up thread from Paula on the silos, on the implementation. Our understanding or interpretation of implementation and follow-up principles, and I think they are listed in the Agenda 2030, are deficient in my view. When I look closely at the principles of SDGs, that they are universal, integrated, and interrelated, we did not mean that for all goals we need to allocate a specific box, a specific financial pot, a specific multilateral organization to deal with it, and then start measuring the progress. It does not only mean that progress in what would hinder progress in others, but also that enhanced focus and improvement in some could lift all other SDGs exponentially. It does not mean that progress must be comparable across 17 SDGs. We made no effort to determine if intervention in some could lift other SDGs. Some SDGs impacts is so powerful that they can galvanize and accelerate progress in other SDGs. And Agenda 2015, as a blueprint that this agenda was, in some ways, I think we have failed to understand the linkages. And I will again pick up this thought in the recommendation part. This is the primary lesson, that the linkages, the universality, integrated, interrelatedness that we thought of is completely way off track. The second lesson I draw, again from my personal experience, and I have served as a head of the UN system in Pakistan from the government side. And I have to pick my words quite carefully, that I don't think that the UN development system reforms that were meant to have actually yield desired result, even if the system has not failed in its most foremost duty. The central purpose of the reform, and I quote the UNSG at that moment, the purpose of reform is simple and clear: to position the UN system best to deliver on humanity's boldest agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if we are on a rescue mission after 8 years, I would leave that judgment to you, how our UN development system and its reforms have actually catered for delivering on this agenda. But we know that there are lessons here. And that lesson is that we cannot expect a different answer or a response from the same people, even if we pose the same question over and over again. You cannot expect a different result. And my own experience, and I have many anecdotes of how UN system operates at the national level. I do not think that the UN system on the ground is geared to deliver on Agenda 2015. The third crucial lesson that I want to draw and lay on emphasis is on seeking commitments of billions of dollars to support the implementation of SDGs. I believe, in some sense, I understand that there is a need for requirement, there is a requirement for a large pot of financing. But in some ways, this has generated false hopes, unrealistic policy options, and divisions between developed and the developing countries on a common agenda. There is a new call for a 500 billion annual stimulus to support countries from Global South before the SDG Summit. I don't know how realistic that is, but let me put some additional numbers before you to make my point. According to UNCTAD, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals will require investment of 2.5 trillion a year in healthcare and education. According to International Energy Agency, a further 13.5 trillion is needed by 2030 to implement Paris Climate Accord. The same agency also concluded that for 1.5 degree compatible scenario, the annual clean energy investment must be tripled by 2030 in the range of 4.2 trillion, with roughly 1.8 trillion for developing countries. Yesterday, I saw its sister organization, Irena, propose a yearly investment of $5 trillion to stay on 1.5 Celsius, or roughly 35 trillion. And according to the report commissioned by the UK and Egypt represented to COP27, about 2 trillion would be required each year by 2030 to help developing countries reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Then comes IPCC in its sixth assessment report, which said investment of 4 to 8 times by 2018. When translated, it comes around $2.2 to $3 trillion. UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance has put in 5.8 to 5.9 trillion dollars by 2030. The UN estimates that adaptation will cost about 160 billion to 340 billion. Let me come to the point now. Maybe I'm naive, but I can't fathom what are we trying to achieve by throwing these numbers out. Are we building a case for failure? These numbers reflect that no one has determined the synergies between all these actions. These numbers are developed in isolation by a particular constituency or an organization dealing with just, let's say, energy, without undertaking how much it can impact other and whether we can reduce cost, which was the central feature of these Sustainable Development Goals: integrated, universal, and interrelated. But we have these amazing numbers ranging into trillions, and in comparison, $100 billion that were needed for climate change, we have failed to meet even that requirement, while we are seeking, while we need, of course, trillions of dollars. So these numbers, and I'll come back to this again when I reflect on the recommendation. Another lesson that became fourth, which is quite valuable in my way, is this: the disconnect between national and the federal government on the one hand, and the global financial architecture. In the era of sustainable development, local governments and local communities are supposed to be in the lead and be the lead development actor. I read in a message or an article that if you look closely at the goals, the underlying target shows that 65% of them are supposed to be implemented by the local government. And yet, neither the local governments are in picture here, and the global financial actors does not operate on that basis. Finally, fifth lesson is that our business case for SDGs has not taken off. There are many reporting formats that we have created, but businesses do not know how to measure progress towards their contribution to the SDGs. I am sitting on the board of International Voluntary Carbon Market, and just to give this anecdote or experience, that it was awfully difficult to figure out how the businesses would measure their impact on environmental and sustainable development safeguards. So eventually it boils down to what we know as do no harm. The moment you move beyond harm, it is difficult to measure the progress. I know that UN Global Compact and United Nations has done a lot, but as far as the realities are concerned, the business case is still missing. So these are 5 lessons that I thought I should put it before you. Now let's go to some of the suggestions from my side. I know that we are preparing for the SDG Summit come September, and there's a lot of activity. There are a few things that I believe could be useful. The first is that we should closely examine the development economics and identify where investment leads to higher results and generates synergies that can lift other SDGs. Now, in my view, those SDGs are very simple: health, education, and social justice. More specifically, 3, 4, and 16. Investment in these goals could lift many other goals. This is the concept of integration and universality and interrelatedness that we were talking about. This is linked to the question of understanding this. The forthcoming summit should focus on finding a correct entry point of investment and identifying, if possible, the level of what that investment is needed in these SDGs, as opposed to trillions of dollar demands for trillions of dollars of investment that we are, or maybe public sector money. It's never clear what we are asking actually. Second, this summit, or the way you are going to work, we should reduce this confusion on financing. There are far too many numbers, and they pander to specific constituency. Every organization and every thematic agenda setting constituency has set out a financing figure. If you put them together, I'm not sure whether the whole word GDP is actually required to manage these changes. I don't wish to suggest establishing a high-level group financing, but these numbers are not helping, in my view. An interagency study led by the World Bank should be done to unpack all these numbers, and that the approach should become part of the summit's outcome. Third, coming back to the business point, it is evidence that SDG's business case has made some progress, but cannot meet the challenge and shift financial resources. As of today, business intervention is limited to 1, do no harm, 2, voluntary commitments, and 3, self-reporting on the indexes such as GRI. Now, these engagement processes are decade old and were not constructed, and were constructed a decade ago to engage the business and private sector. Since then, there hasn't been much improvement, at least as I see, except that reporting formats have become a bit more clearer. We need a different approach. I think as you go down the road of developing thoughts and ideas about the summit, there are 3 things which should be significant to shift the market, shift investment, and put the world back on to achieve the SDGs. And these are putting the price on carbon and establishing a carbon floor, putting a price on natural capital, which Paula very correctly pointed out. These are externalities impacted, and they do not become part of the GDP calculation, or for that matter, calculation of other things. And 3, demanding countries to legislate the role of SDGs to ensure compliance by local businesses operating domestically. We've done this in Pakistan, and things started to change, but not so much. These were regulatory actions that were taken. I think it's time for us to think collectively that these should be legislated, and the governments should be able to enforce. So 3 points: price on carbon, price on natural capital, legislating the role of business in SDGs through the government. 4th, I think we need to put local governments at the center of decision-making in the next 7 years. Unless local governments are empowered, unless the global financial system starts interacting directly with these actors, the achievement of SDGs will remain limited to the glossy reports prepared by well-paid consultants. I think we need to lay emphasis as we move ahead in this direction of negotiating what are going to be the outcome of this. I will also believe there are many other points that I can make regarding the climate change debate. I have deliberately avoided getting into climate change debate, except I did throw some numbers that I read. I do think that the integration of agenda would mean that we work together. And it is a remarkable example that of different numbers or different constituents or different organizations that we are still not on the page where we ought to be. I leave it at here and given the time constraints, and allow if there are any questions that I can post and answer. Thank you, Irena.
Many thanks, Farrukh, and also for coming across the same thing that we need to work together. We need integrated agendas, and your 3 points on price on carbon, on natural capital, and legislating the SDGs, and also the role of local governments, which are very important, and other actors that need to come together for this to happen. So thank you very much for this. And now we go to the comments that we are going to hear from Dr. Marianne Beisheim, who is a senior associate at Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. It's the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Dr. Beisheim has a focus on sustainable development governance and is an expert on the follow-up and review process on the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Among other things, she is a member of the UN Political Advisory Board of the German Federal Foreign Office, the Leadership Council of the SDSN Germany, and the Research Council of the United Nations Association Germany. And she always very faithfully follows everything what is happening at the UN. I know that firsthand. So Marianne, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irena, and thank you for having me. It's an incredible honor to go after you, Paula and Farrukh, and you gave us so much food for thought. It's really excellent. All protocols observed, because I really want to jump right into it. IISD already in their invitation, and you, Farrukh, also mentioned it. It says the Rio+20 outcome, the future we want, and the 2030 Agenda and SDGs gave us a dynamic blueprint for addressing multiple challenges in an integrated manner. And I've been wondering, is that true? And I think yes and no. Yes, the SDGs defined a lot of the what, including also, if we are honest, some ambiguous wording and also trade-offs between the goals and targets. We have heard a lot about the interlinkages and the synergies, but there are also trade-offs. And this was necessary to close the package deal. And yes, the 2030 Agenda's principles indicate some of the how to get there. To be transformative and universal, Paula specifically mentioned to be integrated, more integrated and coherent, also inclusive and participatory, leaving no one behind. But also, I think the exactly how, so what policies and measures will get us there, was at the time left deliberately open, respecting national policies and priorities. That was the formula you find quite often in the 2030 Agenda. And same back in Rio+20, just remember the language and the struggle around the green economy being one of the important tools, and that it could provide options for policy making, but not as a rigid set of rules. So member states have a hard time agreeing on these measures, and that is bad if now at the midterm we see that we need more speed and scope. So the idea back then was that member states would inform each other on how they do it, learn through the voluntary national reviews and the other reviews that happen at the annual HLPF. And to quote the title of today's session, what have we learned? If we look at the VNRs, the peer learning happening each year, I think this was very good for localizing the SDGs, but it doesn't yet really deliver on learning how to achieve true transformation and acceleration. DESA analyzes these VNRs and looks for these kind of SDG good practices. There is a self-reporting database and 2 annual reports so far. This is all praiseworthy, but if you really check it out, the examples given are not fully convincing, and I think member states need to make better use of this space. Just go ahead and check out Farrukh's suggestions on putting a price on carbon, investment in health, education, and social justice as levers, and keep on reporting on whether and how these measures prove to be transformational. This is the kind of learning we need to see now. Also, the scientific reports, just remember the Global Sustainable Development Report back in 2019 very much made Paula's point that we need to be more integrated in proceeding with all these entry points and the transformation pathways and so on. But again, the mandate of this report says, don't be too policy prescriptive. But there is also some good hope. I hear that this year's GSDR, the Global Sustainable Development Report, will indeed, Paula, talk about disruption and how this matters on our way on these transformation pathways. So where do I see more hope? It has been mentioned, water, the water conference this year. Water is a true connector. This is, I think, one of the big lessons we learned from the water conference, and I hope really this will feed into this year's HLPF as well. And I fully agree with Farrukh that the cities, the regional and local governments are really, really relevant for bringing us forward. And we see more and more voluntary local reviews happening at the high-level political forum each year, and that is very good. And I hope, because they really have also this integrated take on things, because the local level is really where it comes all together. Whereas more hope, well, we are still negotiating the political declaration for the SDG Summit in September. Farrukh mentioned it. The first part is on rescue, but there's also a third part, turning our world towards 2030. So that is the action part, the forward-looking part. And the negotiations have only begun. I still hope that member states will bring the high impact initiatives that we need to see in this decade of action, and that they take up the SG's idea of the SDG stimulus, not just repackaging existing financing. So maybe Farrukh's idea, having a working group on these numbers, is a good one. And then next year, we'll have another chance, because Farrukh said the UN system also needs some reform. In 2024, member states decided to have a summit of the future. So that's another opportunity to discuss how to boost the SDG implementation. On the agenda, there is, for example, again, the reform of the financial architecture, how to go beyond GDP as a yardstick. We already discussed that back in Rio+20. How broader measures of social well-being are needed to complement GDP. We'll also discuss for this summit how to use digital innovation and governance as a lever, how to better deal with shocks like COVID or the cost of living crisis now, and how to integrate long-term thinking in decision-making, including youth and future generations, better assessing risks. So that might help us as well. At the end, to sum up, I think political will is crucial. And being a political scientist, I think we need to unpack that term. So what motivates heads of state and government to gear up? And I leave it with this question. Thank you.
Many thanks, Now, yes. Many thanks, Marianne, on this, and also on defining some of the processes that are coming up and how they can influence, and also talking about local voluntary local reviews, which indeed are happening. So that's an encouraging sign. We are coming now to the Q&A part, and I'm going to give the floor back now to Matt, to ISD, to walk us through the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to please turn your video cameras back on and prepare to come off mute. And thank you so much for a really interesting conversation going on in the chat and in the questions. I'm afraid we can't answer all of them today, but we'll do our best, especially given the panelists that we have. The first question, especially considering some of the missed 2020 targets, how do we integrate the GBF targets into the SDGs to achieve the goal of integration, ideally? This isn't really directed, so if anyone has any observations, please feel free to come off mute.
I think part of the problem is that we're still looking at the GBF as an environment or a biodiversity agenda, and it's not. There's no such thing as environment, and this is coming from somebody who's worked on quote unquote environment for a couple of decades now. Everything we do and don't do, our actions and our emissions, have an economic and a social implications. And as long as the GBF is something that is going to be implemented through national biodiversity strategies and action plans, as long as we keep seeing it as something that is about biodiversity and not about the foundations of long-term growth on this planet, of the sustainability and the resilience of our economies and our societies, it's still going to be marginal. We're still going to have the equivalent of SDG 14 or SDG 15.
Thanks very much. Are there any other reflections? Then let's move on to reflections on how to fill the gap. How do we fill the gap between theory and practice? For example, what the SDGs call for, including breaking down silos and delivering what we need, and not what is possible. I know Farrukh shared a number of recommendations, but if anyone else had any points as well, or if you wanted to expand on some of those points, Farrukh.
I can say a few things just to add on to the points that I had made earlier. Colleagues, it's important. I thought I was trying to, I've seen this debate going on or some comments being made. The universality or integrated nature of agenda is not challenged. But we must understand that there are few levels of investment that can make more contribution to SDG agenda immediately and help lift others. It is not a zero-sum game to suggest that we need to invest on 17 of them at the same time with a similar vigor. The synergies are important to be captured. This is the same problem we foresee in the financing numbers. They are not synergistic. They reflect a particular constituency. And this is the same problem we have with the SDGs implementation. We need to find an entry point of investment that can help boost SDGs. We have 7 years. We can't continue with you have experience doing it once. You cannot continue to do it over and over again and expect a different result. Thank you.
There was a question, and I don't want to misinterpret your words, Marianne. I think you wanted to put to the panel, how do we unpack the political will that motivates heads of state? Or perhaps if you want to come off mute and restate a question that I think you applied to the entire panel.
Well, I just started to work with my colleagues at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and the name already says it. They are not experts on sustainable development, but rather they work in general on countries. And I asked them, okay, what do you think, looking at your countries? Have you ever heard of the SDGs in the context on what you work on usually? And what do you think? How are they embedded in everyday politics? And politics here is the key issue. I want to learn from them. How do the political elites in many countries see the SDGs? Is there a political will to put them up front? And actually, it seems to me that in many countries, in the context of the localization, it's not that, you know, the strategies were adapted to the SDGs, but rather the other way around. There was a lot of pick and choose. And I think the midterm review is really now the time to come up and question our strategies for implementation. And that is also true for my own country, to check out the strategy we have been using so far. Is that the right one? Is it really transformational? Are we really there? Are we really policy coherent in our implementation? And if not, what do we need to do? And disruption here really is the key word. But how do we get there? I mean, politicians are not really eager about disruption policies. So phasing the GSDR puts it, this year's GSDR, we need to phase in sustainable development policies, but we also need to phase out the unsustainable policies that are in place. And I think that is also what is causing a lot of disruptions, because it creates winners and losers. And we need to think about ways how to deal with that and how to make politicians want to go forward with this. Paula, I was expecting you to.
Yeah, no, I
one.
just want to say that, look, the reason we wrote the book together with Patty of the genesis of the SDGs was so people would understand how incredibly impossible it was, and the fact that we almost lost the SDG, even down at the bitter end. And the opposition was incredible, particularly from a lot of the folk that were working on development and had the MDGs tacked on their walls and had their development agendas, bilateral aid, et cetera, organized around it. So of course you can't expect politicians who are already wedded to one agenda, one way of doing things, to really up the ante. And what was decisive was actually you, the civil society. The big event that happened in Germany, the name unfortunately eludes me right now, somebody please fill me in, that was led by Felix Dodds and everybody else at the Stakeholder Forum and others. That was incredible, because there you had about 1,300 civil society organizations that signed up for the SDGs and that said, this is the agenda we need, and helped push that kind of an agenda and push governments to agree to getting the SDGs be a part of the zero draft. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. Civil society plays a decisive role. What we all have to understand is that you cannot just keep thinking that we can tweak development and tweak things, but really ask ourselves, what is that kind of deep shifts that are needed in our food systems, in our energy systems, in how we manage water, in how we tackle, somebody said on the chat, human rights. Those are the agendas that we have to really look at, because there's not just the biodiversity and the climate crisis, there's an equity crisis, and there's a pollution crisis. And these crises have to be at the forefront of what civil society is pushing for, and enlightened private sector. Private sector, there are some great leaders there. We need to team up and demand change, bring about change.
Irena, please go ahead.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. With so many years of Zoom, you still have to master sometimes. No, I actually want to agree with both what Marianne and Paula have said, but also for talking about civil society. I have recently started, even though I was working with civil society a lot, I have seen that also the question for civil society is that oftentimes there is not how I would say there is not enough of the of things to in one place that can be really. There are a lot of things are happening. There are a lot of people who are doing things, writing things. There are a lot of policies. There are a lot of actions. There are a lot of projects. There are even some databases, but they are more like repository of things. They're really not. They are not kind of an ecosystem of things that you can get to, and if you want to do certain things, that they unpack them. So I think this is something which is really, really needed. And we are trying in the stakeholder forum now with the webinars that we are doing on the SDGs, but also we will hopefully get to some kind of communities of practice and a database where these things can come together, and where civil society and all the other actors can come together and find things that they can actually do in their how actually to make this kind of I would say pathways towards the acceleration, and how to talk to the governments, to policymakers, and to the private sector to have this kind of things together. So I think this is something which is really really needed, and I'm really grateful to all of you for saying that and actually ascertaining what we have found out ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah.
No.
So, I guess if I can, thank you so much. We've run over our time. I know that our panelists need to get to their next call. Thank you for joining us. We'll be sending an email with links to the articles, the books, the upcoming webinars. I know Stakeholder Forum has some. We have ISD has some upcoming to keep this conversation going. As you can see, 1 hour is certainly not enough to talk about all of this. Thank you so much for joining us, Paula, Marianne, Farrukh, Irena. Great to collaborate with you, and have a wonderful day, evening, everybody who's been listening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very
Bye.
much for the
Thank you.
invitation. Bye-bye.